Welcome back to the Old West Tales, where every story whispers secrets of love, heartbreak, and redemption. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. Drop your location in the comments. I'm curious which part of the world my viewers are from. Sit back and let me take you on a journey that might just melt your heart tonight. The autumn wind carried dust through the narrow streets of Silver Ridge, Wyoming Territory, as riders gathered outside the courthouse. Sheriff Thomas Calloway had been the most respected lawman in 3 counties, a man who believed justice belonged to everyone, rich or poor. But before sunrise, he had been found dead beside the old canyon road with a bullet through his chest. The only witness claimed he saw rancher Jacob Carter argue with the sheriff only hours before the shooting. Jacob had disappeared before dawn, and the town quickly judged him guilty. The sheriff's only daughter, 24-year-old Charlotte Calloway, stood silently beside her father's grave, wearing a black riding dress beneath a long, dark coat. She never shed a tear in public. Instead, she made herself a promise. Whoever had taken her father from her would lose everything they owned. Nearly 2 years later, Charlotte returned from Boston after settling her father's estate. She was now one of the wealthiest women in Wyoming Territory, owning the sheriff's house, several businesses, and enough money to influence the entire town. During those 2 years, Jacob Carter had quietly returned and rebuilt his struggling ranch. Most people refused to speak to him, believing he had escaped punishment only because there was never enough evidence for a trial. Children whispered when he rode into town. Shopkeepers watched him carefully. Jacob accepted the hatred without complaint, believing nothing he said would ever change anyone's mind. Charlotte rode toward Carter Ranch determined to destroy the man she blamed for her father's death. She intended to buy every neighboring grazing lease, cut off his water rights, and force him to abandon the land his family had worked for generations. When she arrived, however, she found something she never expected. Instead of a wealthy outlaw, Jacob lived in a weathered ranch house with his younger sister Emma and an aging ranch hand named Ben. The fences were falling apart. The cattle herd was smaller than she remembered. Jacob himself looked older than 32, with tired blue eyes and hands scarred by years of hard work. Jacob greeted Charlotte respectfully despite recognizing her immediately. "Miss Calloway," he said quietly, "I'm sorry for your loss. Your father deserved better." Charlotte's eyes hardened. "Don't pretend to honor the man you murdered." Jacob didn't argue. He simply lowered his head. "I understand why you believe that." His calm response irritated her more than anger would have. She informed him that she had legally purchased the grazing land bordering his ranch. Without access to that pasture, feeding his cattle through winter would become nearly impossible. Jacob nodded without protest. "If that's what you decided, I won't stop you. You should fight back. I'm tired of fighting people who have already judged me." Charlotte left disappointed. She had expected rage, threats, perhaps even violence. Instead, she found a man who carried his reputation like a heavy burden. That evening, Jacob gathered his remaining cattle before an approaching storm. While repairing a broken fence, he noticed smoke rising from the northern pasture. Racing across the fields, he discovered several hay barns burning. Masked riders disappeared into the darkness before he could recognize them. The fire destroyed nearly half his winter feed. The next morning, rumors spread that Jacob had burned his own barns to collect insurance money. Charlotte believed the story until she visited the ruins herself. There she noticed something unusual. Deep horseshoe prints surrounded the burned buildings. At least 6 different horses had been present. Jacob owned only 2. Ben quietly approached Charlotte after she finished examining the ground. "Miss Calloway," the old ranch hand whispered, "those men weren't robbers. They've been watching this ranch for weeks." "Who?" "I don't know, but somebody wants Jacob ruined." Charlotte dismissed the warning and rode away. Days later, she attended a town council meeting where businessman Victor Langford proposed purchasing Jacob's ranch to expand his railroad shipping company. The offer seemed generous, but Jacob refused politely. "I'll never sell my family's land." Victor smiled pleasantly before replying, "Everyone has a price." Watching from across the room, Charlotte noticed several influential townsmen exchanging nervous glances with Victor. Among them was Deputy Marshal Owen Briggs, the man who had investigated her father's murder years earlier. After the meeting, Charlotte entered the sheriff's old office to collect family documents. Hidden inside her father's locked desk, she discovered an unfinished notebook. The final pages describe an investigation into illegal weapons being transported through Silver Ridge under protection of powerful businessmen. Her father's final handwritten sentence stopped Charlotte cold. "If anything happens to me, Jacob Carter is innocent. He's the only man I still trust." The words felt impossible. Her father had written them the night before he died. Charlotte stared at the page until her hands trembled. For the first time since the funeral, she wondered if she had spent 2 years hating the wrong man. Charlotte barely slept that night. She read the final pages of her father's notebook over and over, hoping she had misunderstood the words. Yet the handwriting was unmistakably his. Sheriff Thomas Calloway had trusted Jacob Carter until the very end. By sunrise, she rode to Carter Ranch carrying the notebook inside her saddlebag, unsure whether to confront Jacob or apologize. When she arrived, she found him repairing another section of fence that had been cut during the night. Several of his cattle had wandered onto neighboring land. Instead of chasing them, someone had shot 2 of the animals and left them where they fell. Jacob knelt beside the dead steer with quiet frustration, running his hand across its neck before standing. When he saw Charlotte approaching, he expected another accusation. Instead, she simply asked, "Can we talk?" Jacob led her into the ranch house, where Emma served coffee, before quietly leaving them alone. Charlotte placed the notebook on the table. Jacob recognized it immediately. The sheriff always carried that with him. He said softly. Charlotte opened to the final page. "Did you know about this?" Jacob slowly shook his head. As he read the last sentence, his expression filled with sadness instead of relief. He never got the chance to tell anyone. Charlotte looked directly into his eyes for the first time, without anger clouding her judgment. "Tell me what really happened the night my father died." Jacob took a long breath before speaking. 2 years earlier, Sheriff Calloway had secretly asked for his help because cattle shipments leaving Silver Ridge weren't carrying only livestock. Hidden beneath the cattle were crates of stolen Army rifles being sold to outlaw gangs across the territory. The sheriff suspected someone powerful inside town government was protecting the operation, but he didn't know who. Since Jacob often delivered cattle throughout the region, he could move around without attracting attention. Together, they quietly gathered evidence. On the night the sheriff was killed, they planned to meet at Black Rock Canyon, where the next illegal shipment was scheduled to pass. Jacob arrived late after one of his horses threw a shoe. By the time he reached the canyon, the sheriff had already been shot. Hearing riders approaching, Jacob hid behind the rocks and watched several masked men load crates into wagons before riding away. Knowing he would be blamed because people had seen him arguing publicly with the sheriff earlier that day, he fled instead of reporting what he had seen. It became the greatest mistake of his life. Charlotte listened without interrupting. Every detail matched her father's unfinished notes. Yet one question remained unanswered. "Why didn't you come back after things settled down?" Jacob stared toward the window. "Because nobody would have believed me. The deputy had already declared me guilty before sunrise. I would have been hanged before anyone listened." Charlotte realized he was probably right. The town had wanted a simple answer, and Jacob had become the perfect villain. Determined to uncover the truth, Charlotte proposed they continue her father's investigation together. Jacob hesitated. "If the Rayall killers are still here, they'll come after you too." Charlotte answered firmly, "They're already watching me. The moment I found this notebook, I became a threat." They began searching through Sheriff Calloway's remaining files hidden beneath loose floorboards in the old jail office. Most records were ordinary arrest reports, but one locked metal box contained maps showing unusual freight routes leading from Victor Langford's warehouse to abandoned mining camps deep in the mountains. Inside the box was also a list of shipment dates written in code. While Jacob studied the maps, Charlotte discovered something folded between 2 reports. It was half of a torn receipt bearing Victor Langford's signature, and the initials OB. Jacob immediately recognized them. Owen Briggs. Charlotte's heart sank. Deputy Marshal Owen Briggs had served beside her father for nearly 10 years. He had comforted her after the funeral and promised to find the killer, if Jacob was right. Briggs hadn't been searching for the murderer. He had been protecting him. Before they could discuss the discovery further, Emma burst through the office door. "Someone's at the ranch," she shouted. 3 riders. Jacob and Charlotte hurried outside. They arrived just in time to see masked men setting fire to the main barn. Flames climbed rapidly through the dry wooden walls, while terrified horses kicked against their stalls. Without hesitation, Jacob ran straight into the burning building. Charlotte ignored his shouted warning and followed him inside. Thick smoke filled the air as burning beams crashed around them. Together they managed to free every horse, except one trapped beneath a fallen support post. Jacob strained to lift the heavy timber, but it refused to move. Charlotte grabbed a nearby wagon jack and wedged it beneath the beam. Working together, they raised it high enough for a frightened horse to escape seconds before the roof collapsed behind them. Outside, the masked riders had vanished into the hills. Nearly the entire barn was reduced to ashes. As neighbors gathered to help extinguish the remaining flames, Charlotte noticed one rider watching from a distant ridge through a spyglass. Though she couldn't see his face, his expensive black horse was impossible to mistake. It belonged to Victor Langford. That evening, Charlotte secretly searched Victor's warehouse, while Jacob kept watch outside. Hidden beneath stacks of grain sacks, she found dozens of wooden crates marked as farming equipment. Curious, she pried one open. Inside were brand-new army rifles wrapped in oilcloth. Before she could inspect them further, footsteps echoed across the warehouse floor. She quickly hid behind the crates as Victor entered with Deputy Owen Briggs. "You should have killed Carter when you had the chance," Victor said coldly. Briggs removed his hat and wiped sweat from his forehead. "We almost did today." Victor frowned. Almost isn't good enough. Now Calloway's daughter is asking questions. Briggs looked uneasy. She found something. Victor's expression darkened. Then both of them need to disappear before the next shipment leaves town. Charlotte covered her mouth to keep from gasping. Every terrible suspicion had just become reality. As she carefully backed toward the rear exit, her boot accidentally struck a loose metal bucket. The sharp clang echoed through the warehouse. Silence followed. Then Victor's voice rang out across the darkness. "Someone's here." Within seconds, armed men spread through the warehouse as Charlotte sprinted for the back door. Jacob heard the shouting and rushed inside just as gunfire exploded behind her. A bullet shattered a lantern, plunging the warehouse into chaos. Jacob grabbed Charlotte's hand, and together they escaped through a rear window, racing into the night with Victor's hired gunmen close behind. By the time they reached the river, they realized one terrifying truth. The conspiracy that had murdered Sheriff Calloway was far larger than either of them had imagined, and now every powerful man in Silver Ridge wanted them dead. Jacob pulled Charlotte behind a rocky bank of the river as bullets ripped through the cottonwood trees above them. Moonlight reflected across the rushing water, while Victor Langford's gunmen spread out on horseback. Believing the pair had nowhere to escape, Jacob quietly led Charlotte downstream until they reached a narrow passage hidden by thick brush. It was an old smuggler's trail, known only to ranchers who had driven cattle through the valley for years. The gunmen searched in the wrong direction, allowing Jacob and Charlotte to disappear into the hills. They spent the rest of the night inside an abandoned line shack high above Silver Ridge. Sitting beside a small fire, Charlotte finally looked at Jacob without suspicion. "I spent 2 years trying to destroy your life," she said softly. "I'm sorry." Jacob stared into the flames before answering. "You were trying to protect your father's memory. I never blamed you for that." The bitterness Charlotte had carried since her father's funeral slowly gave way to guilt. She realized a man she had hated had suffered just as much as she had. The following morning they returned secretly to Emma's ranch house, only to discover it had been ransacked. Furniture lay broken across the floor, drawers had been emptied, and Sheriff Calloway's notebook was gone. Emma and Ben were missing. For one terrifying moment Jacob feared the worst, but then he noticed a familiar carving on the porch railing. Ben had left a small cross-shaped mark, a signal he used during cattle drives to indicate someone had escaped safely. Following the trail into the nearby hills, Jacob and Charlotte found Emma and Ben hiding inside a narrow cave. Ben explained that Victor's men had searched the ranch shortly after dawn. They were looking for the sheriff's records and intended to burn the house if they found anyone inside. Fortunately, Ben had seen them coming and led Emma to safety. While they discussed their next move, Ben revealed a secret he had hidden for years. On the night Sheriff Calloway was murdered, Ben had been camped near Black Rock Canyon, repairing a broken wagon wheel. He had seen several riders leave the canyon after hearing a gunshot. One rider removed his mask while crossing the creek, believing no one was nearby. Ben recognized him immediately. It was Deputy Owen Briggs. Fear had kept Ben silent because Briggs controlled the law, and no one would believe an old ranch hand over the deputy marshal. Now, with Victor openly trying to kill everyone connected to the investigation, Ben realized silence would only create more victims. Charlotte knew they finally had a witness, but they still needed undeniable proof before confronting powerful men who controlled the town. Jacob remembered something Sheriff Calloway had once mentioned. The sheriff had hidden copies of important evidence, somewhere no criminal would ever think to search. Together they rode to the small white church on the edge of town where Reverend Samuel Green had been one of Thomas Calloway's closest friends. After hearing everything, the elderly minister quietly unlocked a storage room beneath the church. Hidden inside an old wooden Bible chest was a sealed metal lockbox that Sheriff Calloway had entrusted to him only days before his death, with instructions to release it only if Charlotte ever questioned the official story. Inside the box were signed freight records, coded payment ledgers, maps of the smuggling routes, and letters connecting Victor Langford to outlaw gangs across Wyoming territory. Most importantly, there was a signed confession from a dying stagecoach robber who admitted that Victor had hired armed men to protect illegal weapon shipments. The confession also stated that Deputy Owen Briggs had accepted regular payments to destroy evidence and eliminate anyone who threatened the operation. Sheriff Calloway had nearly completed the case before he was murdered. Charlotte immediately wanted to ride to the courthouse, but Reverend Green warned her that Briggs still controlled the local deputies. They needed someone beyond Silver Ridge's influence. Jacob suggested riding to Fort Laramie, where the U.S. Marshal's office could send federal deputies. Charlotte agreed. She and Jacob left before sunset with the evidence hidden inside a saddlebag, while Ben and Emma remained behind to create a distraction. Victor soon learned the evidence had vanished from the church. Furious, he gathered every hired gun he could find and raced after Jacob and Charlotte. The chase stretched across open prairie, through narrow canyons, and over steep ridges. As they approached Eagle Pass, Victor's men caught up. Gunfire echoed across the cliffs. Jacob and Charlotte took cover behind massive boulders, while Victor shouted from horseback, "Throw down the evidence, and I'll let one of you live." Charlotte stepped beside Jacob, revolver in hand. "You murdered my father." Victor laughed. "Your father died because he believed the law mattered more than money." The firefight erupted. Jacob's years as a rancher had made him an expert marksman. He shot the rifles from two gunmen's hands without killing them. Charlotte fired with calm determination, forcing several riders to retreat. During the battle, Briggs attempted to circle behind them, but Ben arrived unexpectedly with several neighboring ranchers who had finally decided they had endured Victor's corruption long enough. The ranchers blocked the escape route, while Emma rode straight to Fort Laramie with the evidence. Knowing everything was falling apart, Victor grabbed Charlotte from behind and pressed a revolver against her head. "Drop your gun, Carter." Jacob slowly lowered his revolver, but before Victor could pull the trigger, Briggs raised his own weapon toward Victor. "You promised we'd both get away." Victor looked at him with contempt. "I was never taking you with me." Realizing he had been betrayed, Briggs turned his revolver on Victor. Both men fired at the same instant. Briggs fell dead from a shot to the chest, while Victor staggered backward after Jacob's bullet struck his shoulder. Victor tried to flee on horseback, but federal deputies from Fort Laramie arrived at the entrance of the pass, led by U.S. Marshal Henry Wallace, who had received Emma's warning. Trapped on every side, Victor surrendered without another shot. Weeks later, the federal investigation uncovered the full extent of the smuggling network. Victor Langford had spent years shipping stolen Army weapons to outlaw gangs across the frontier while bribing officials to protect his operation. Deputy Owen Briggs had murdered Sheriff Thomas Calloway to prevent the evidence from reaching federal authorities. The surviving members of the gang were arrested, and Silver Ridge finally learned the truth. Jacob Carter was publicly cleared of every accusation. The town that had once shunned him now apologized, though Jacob accepted their words with quiet humility rather than anger. On a bright spring morning, the people of Silver Ridge gathered as a new memorial was unveiled in front of the courthouse. Sheriff Thomas Calloway's name was engraved beneath the words, "He gave his life for justice." Charlotte stepped forward and addressed the crowd. She admitted that hatred had blinded her and that an innocent man had paid the price for her grief. Then she invited Jacob to stand beside her as the town applauded the rancher whose courage had finally exposed the truth. Months later, the Carter Ranch was thriving again. New fences stretched across green pastures, healthy cattle grazed peacefully, and laughter once again filled the old ranch house. Charlotte often rode out to help with the work, discovering she enjoyed ranch life far more than the wealthy social circles she had once known. One evening, as the sun dipped below the Wyoming mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Jacob led her to a hill overlooking the valley where they had fought so hard to protect the land. He gently took her hand and smiled. We both spent years chasing the past. Charlotte smiled back through happy tears. Maybe it's finally time we start building the future. As a warm western breeze swept across the open prairie, they shared their first kiss beneath the endless Wyoming sky, knowing that the truth had not only brought justice to Silver Ridge, but had also turned revenge and forgiveness and two wounded hearts into one lasting love. I love all of you, my wonderful audience of Wild West Tales. Tell me how this story made you feel. Leave a comment below. Type 1 if you love this story. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more epic tales from the wild.